Yeah, we're now live.
Thank you. I will ask each person present to confirm that they can hear and be heard. Where practicable, please also have your video switched on. We have the following members of the forum. Beverly Blower.
Good morning, everyone. I can see and hear you all.
Thank you. Dan Breary. Alex Davis.
Morning, I can hear and see.
Morning. Paul Deneen.
I can see and hear.
Good morning. Nikki Emmett.
Morning all, I can see and hear.
Morning. Richard Foster.
Good morning, I can see and hear.
Thank you. Nikki Gilbert. Andy Gosling.
Yes, I can see and hear.
Good morning. Georgie
Good
Griffin.
morning.
Sue Jenkins. Paul Jennings.
Good morning, I can see and hear you. Thanks, Alison.
Thank you. Tim Knapp.
Yes, joined. Might still be.
Okay, thank you. Chris Lewandowski.
Good morning, all. Yes, I can see and hear you. Thank you.
Thank you. Rose Lloyd.
Good morning, I can see and hear you.
Good morning. Hayley Manns.
Good morning, I can see and hear you.
Good morning. I'd like to welcome two new members to the forum this morning. Claire Perez and Rachel Usher.
Good morning, I can see and hear everyone.
Thank you. Kathy Weston. Okay, thank you, everyone. The following officers may also be in attendance. Claire Bellis-Powley.
Confirmed, I can see and hear.
Thank you. Isabel Biggs.
Good morning, I can hear and see you.
Thank you. Liz Farr.
Good morning, everyone. I can see and hear you.
Thank you. Hilary Jones.
Morning, everyone. I can see and hear you.
Morning. Kirsty Lister. Rachel Sanders. Wendy Pickering. And Councillor Ivan Powell. Okay, thank you, everybody. The agenda papers and other relevant information for this meeting are available for public viewing on the Herefordshire Council website. The Council is streaming this meeting live on the Herefordshire Council YouTube channel, and a recording will be made available via the Council's website shortly after the meeting has concluded. Others are permitted to film, photograph and record our public meetings, providing that it does not disrupt the business of the meeting. Please use the raise hand icon to indicate that you wish to speak. Please remember to lower your hand again after you have spoken. Where forum members are required to vote on an item, we will conduct an electronic vote. If there are problems with the electronic vote, I will ask each member in turn to indicate verbally if they are for, against, or abstaining. If a forum member has not been present for the whole of the discussion on an item due to technical failure, they should not vote on that item. Are there any questions about the procedures before we continue? Okay, thank you, everyone. So item 1 is apologies for absence. Are there any apologies?
Thank you, Chair. We've had apologies from Gemma Martin, the Diocese of Hereford, and also from officers, we've had Louise Tanner.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to item 2, named substitutes. Are there any named substitutes this morning?
No named substitutes, Chair.
Thank you. Item 3 is declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest this morning? Okay, thank you, everyone. Moving on to item 4, the minutes. So this is an item to approve and sign the minutes of the meeting held on the 20th of January 2025. Are there any matters arising not dealt with elsewhere on the agenda? Okay, thank you. Please bring up the voting screen. If you were not present at the last meeting, you should select the abstention option at the vote.
Chair, those minutes are approved.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to item 5, the High Needs Budget 2025-26. The purpose of this item is for Schools Forum to consider and recommend a high needs budget of £45.7 million for 2025-26 for approval by the Cabinet Member for Children and Young People as set out in Appendices 1, 2 and 3, noting the funding gap in 2025-26 of £20.2 million, that being 253% higher than the funding gap agreed for 2024-25. I call on Claire Bellis-Powley to present the report, please.
Okay, so I'll just share my presentation. Okay, can everybody see that?
That's come through, Claire, thank you.
Okay, so welcome to the High Needs Block budget presentation. So we are now presenting our final block for 25-26. So you'll remember that I brought to the Schools Forum the other 3 blocks in January. So the schools block, the central block, and then the early years block that I discussed with the providers before Christmas. So we are at the last block now, before we start putting in action the budget on the 1st of April. So just a little bit of background on the high needs block funding for 25-26. So the allocation that the DfE have given us is 28.9 million. So that is 7.6% higher year on year than 24-25. We've also got some transfers into the high needs block from the other blocks. So you'll remember from the Schools Forum in January that the schools block has transferred in 0.7 million to fund the SEND protection scheme. We've also got 0.2 million transferred from the early years block for the SEND inclusion fund. So that is that's to fund the SEND pupils within the early years providers. And then we've got 0.3 million coming in from the central block. So the total transfers total 1.1 million. Which will be greatly received to aid with our funding there. The other change for 25-26 that's noted in bullet point 3 is that there's 3 grants currently that stand alone for 24-25, which is the Teachers Pay Additional Grant, the Teachers Pension Employer Contribution Grant, and then the Core Schools Budget Grant Uplift. Now, what's going to happen in 25-26 is those 3 grants are going to be rolled into one grant called the Core Schools Budget Grant. So, you know, the DfE are trying to streamline things somewhat. So just as a comparison, though, the schools block has got those grants rolled into its NFF now, but for high needs block, it does stay as a grant, but it's one separate grant rather than 3 grants. The last thing I want to note is the SEND protection scheme. So I've run this past the budget working group, and I will present some options to the Schools Forum at the end of this presentation on that. So the next slide really just puts into numbers what I've just said in words. So it actually shows all the blocks of funding here. The middle section is the high needs block. So on the top line of that section, you can see the 28.9 million. Which is what I just described. So that's our allocation. We then have the recoupment coming out, which is where the ESFA take the funding for the academies and pay them directly. So I don't get that funding in my hand. And then what I've added in then is my block transfers from the other blocks, which I just described. So the 1.1 million. So net in my hand for 25-26, I have 25.5 million. And I will come back to that figure as to how I plan to spend it. So that's a net increase year on year of 6.2%. So before I launch into the detail of 25-26, I just want to have a look with you at 24-25 and what's happening there. So in Q3, we'd forecast a full year deficit of 11.1 million. Now, if we add that to the deficit brought forward at the start of 24-25, at the end of 24-25, I would have a cumulative deficit of 17.2 million. So what's driving my in-year pressure of 11.1 million? Well, there's two main reasons. The first reason is that there's a shortage of local authority special schools, and hence I therefore have to use independent school places, which are costly. And the increase in the independent school places has increased by 68% from, that's from January through to December. The second thing that is driving up costs in 24-25 are the top-up funding. So that's the Element 3 funding, which is correlated with an increase in ECHPs. So both those issues aren't isolated to Herefordshire. It's being seen nationally across all local authorities. The last point that I want to remind you of is point 3. So currently we can ring fence our TSG deficit. So that means we don't have to roll it into the council results. However, that legislation is going to revoke in March 26, and councils will have to start rolling that result into their reserves, which is, a very high risk for Herefordshire and all councils nationally. So let's start looking at what we're going to do for 25-26. So you can see in the first 3 columns here, it's talking about what I just said in 24-25. So the third column is highlighting my in-year deficit of 11.1 million. And then what we've started to do in the fourth column is to build up our budget for 25-26. So the way we do that is we look at the forecast, which is our final position for 24-25. So what's happening now, and then we roll that forward into 25-26 and build anything new that we want to add into there. So at the bottom of that fourth column, you can see that the funding required for high needs for 25-26 is 45.7 million. The funding I have in my hand, which I described to you in previous slides, is 25.5 million. So the difference between those is the 20.2 million deficit. So year on year, you can see sort of the main pressures, which is driving my increase in 25-26 ringed in red, and I will go through those in the next slide. So the top point in this slide is really what I just said. So funding required is 45.7 million. I have in my hand 25.5 million. So I'm going to have an in-year deficit of 20.2 million. Now, if I add that to my 17.2 million deficit, which I'm going to have at the end of 24-25, my cumulative deficit as at the end of March 2026 is therefore going to be 37.4 million. So where are my pressures year on year? Why is my budget increasing by so much? Well, one of the main pressures is independent schools. So that's the pressure we're seeing in 24-25 that more than continues into 25-26. We spent some time budgeting this line. So we went through it. We looked at the current cohort of children in independent schools, which was 188 children for 24-25. And we literally went down it line by line to decide, is that child going to stay in an independent school for 25-26? If they do, is it a full year effect or is it going to be a part year effect? So again, we worked with the service line by line with that, but then we also had to factor in some growth on that current cohort, which, working with the service, we decided that growth would be very similar to what we've seen in 24-25. So we added on another 110 pupils there. So the spend in 24-25 for independent schools is 11.3 million, and then that will increase to 20.6 million in 25-26. The other area where we're seeing increases in 25-26 is for top-up. So we worked with the service to agree a 4% uplift on the Element 3 tariffs there. So we will see an increase because of that in the budget year. Autism basis is going up by 22% year on year, and that's because we've added in 8 placements to Ayleston. Resource bases and social, emotional, mental health bases are going up by nearly 80%. So you've got 16 placements being added into resource bases into Hampton Dean. So there's 2 new classrooms from January 26 there. And then we've also got 24 new places in the SEMH in the Trinity and Brookfield provisions. And then lastly, another significant year-on-year increase is the SEND protection, where it's nearly 15% year-on-year increase there. And in the next slide, I'm actually going to take you through some of the options that we modelled there. And so the 15% increase here is the most affordable option that I've modelled in at this point. I think the last thing to note is in Appendix 3, we've done quite a detail on the placement data. So we've got kind of the current year, and we've also got 25-26 by the different provisions that we're going to be looking at. So, I mean, you can see that in Appendix 3, and I think it's worth noting that the placements in 24-25 are 1,089, and that goes up to 1,347 in 25-26. So that's a 24% increase. So SEND protection, we've mentioned it a couple of times now. So I'm going to take you through some of the modelling that we've done on that. So in previous years, and also in the budget working group and the schools forum in January 25, it's apparent that it's a very well received, it's highly supported, and the schools in many respects rely on the funding that we provide from the SEND protection scheme. Just to outline how it works. So the SEND protection scheme rewards schools, if you like, for taking over the average number of SEND pupils. So it promotes inclusivity into the borough. And I've reminded the Schools Forum already that that Schools Forum back in January approved a block transfer from the schools block to the high needs block of 0.7 million. So we have that already to help with the affordability. And once I got the approval in January, I promised to go away and complete the modelling to find out how much the high needs block would then have to put in order to fund this scheme for 25-26. So I've created two options, which I presented to Budget Working Group and which I'll now present to you. So option one is very much the scheme I inherited when I started my role. It's been in operation for many years and has worked for many years. Now, the formula that's used is that it takes the SEND child number in each school and it times it by 6,000, and then we minus off the number of registered students times 175, which we call the cap. So if we use that formula for 24-25, we can see, the cap's 175 and it produces a full year cost of 1.4 million. So the contribution from the schools block for that is nearly 0.7 million, and it's almost an equal contribution required from the high needs block. So that's what's happening this year. Now, if we apply the same formula at 25-26 and we increase the cap slightly to help with affordability, you can see that the cost goes up quite considerably to over £2 million in every single case that I've modelled here. The reason the cost goes up to over 2 million is because the SEND child number is increasing in 25-26, but also the number of registered students is going down in 25-26 by just over 300. And so hence the difference between those two calculations increases, and hence our full year cost increases. So you can see we've already got the schools block transfer of 0.7 million here, but the high needs block, in order to fund that over 2 million full year cost, is, it's very extreme. So it's 1.6 million, 1.5 million, and then 1.3 million. And considering that, I've already showed you the in-year deficit of 20.2 million, we consider this option to be unaffordable, given the current restraints on the high needs block. So we came up with a second option, which is we wanted to keep it as similar as possible. So we used the same formula. However, instead of the SEND child number times 6,000, we've decided to use 5,000. The way we got the 5,000 is to basically take the ORPU, so the basic entitlement for primary KS3, KS4 for 25-26, and we took an average of them, and that's how we got our 5,000. Now, if we use that formula, you can see that for 25-26, if we increase the cap slightly and we use the new formula, then the full year cost drops. So instead of being over 2 million, it comes in at 1.5 million. So still high, but way more affordable than option one. So the contribution to afford that would be 0.7 million from the schools block, and then just over, well, nearly 0.9 million from the high needs block. So this is the council's preferred option, and this is the option that was recommended to Schools Forum by the Budget Working Group. I think it's really worth highlighting here that we have struggled this year to make this funding work. And we saw in January that when we tried to get the schools block transfer, we had to make a number of compromises there. We managed to do it though. And also to do this high needs block contribution here this time, again, there's a lot of compromises that have to be made to achieve this. So I'm proposing here that this is probably the last year we can use this methodology. We will go away and look at different methodologies so that hopefully we can retain the SEND protection scheme, but it may be that in working all this through that we can't. But this year we will endeavour, we're hoping that the Schools Forum approve this at the 1.5 million. The last thing that I want to highlight in my presentation is we have updated the trade unions SLA. So just to put this into context, so in the schools block, the primary schools receive their trade union activity via delegations, which is taken out of their schools block allocation. This isn't the case for secondary schools and special schools and academies. They choose whether to buy into a service level agreement. So in 24-25, this service level agreement was funded in the following way. So we took £2.70 per pupil, which is basically the de-delegated amount that we use for primary schools, and that covers the teacher trade union activity. And then we add on 35 pence per pupil for the non-teacher trade union activity. So in total, that's £3.05 per pupil, which we then times by 4 for special schools, and that gets to £12.20 per pupil. So we've looked at this now. We're now in a position to look at the funding received at the end of 24-25 and what everyone has paid. And what we're able to offer in 25-26 is a reduction for special schools. So we're going, the methodology, how we calculated this is similar again. So we're going to use the £2.76 per pupil, which again is the primary school de-delegated amount. So we're trying to streamline things. We've added on the 35 pence per pupil for the non-teacher trade unions. And so the cost per pupil has drastically reduced for special schools to £3.11 per pupil. So just to put that into context, if we take a special school, say of 73 pupils, the cost per year reduces. So instead of £908 per year, which was using the old methodology, it drops to £227 per year. So a good saving there of £700 per year. So you know, we are strapped for cash this year. We have got an in-year deficit of 20.2 million, but it's, you know, just to highlight that, you know, we are in every way looking possible to help schools. Where we can push money to schools, we will. Where we can push savings to schools, we will. So that sort of reaches the end of my presentation. So I'd like to hand over to the Democratic Department now to recommend and approve for Cabinet approval. So to approve the high needs budget of 45.7 million, which produces an in-year deficit brought forward of 20.2 million. To approve option 2 for the SEND protection scheme. And in doing that, to approve the placements, the costing per pupil and the inflation recommendations as per Appendix 3.
Okay, thank you, Claire, for that really detailed and really clear presentation. Before we move to the vote, are there any questions for Claire this morning? Okay, it's Chris Lewandowski, I think, with hand up.
Thank you, Chair. I have one question. It refers to Appendix 2 on page 25. And the line I'm looking at is about 2/3 of the way down the page, and it's the cost of independent special schools. Now, from the figures in the table, that is rising from this year 6.8 million to next year to 18.3 million, which is a very large increase, 168.9%. First of all, is there an explanation? Presumably it's because there are more pupils that need special independent schools. But the real question is, what's going to happen the following year? Will that increase keep going up? And how much will it cost in 2026-27? Thank you.
Shall I respond,
Sure.
Claire, initially, if that's okay, Chair?
Yeah, fine.
Yes, there's an exponential rise in special school placements in the independent sector. that is because of the increased demand for specialist education. It is likely to continue to increase unless there is significant funding into the Herefordshire Special School estate. Our special schools are full. We continue to lobby the Department for Education around building projects, whether that be rebuilding or new building, because unless we can expand that provision in Herefordshire, then it is likely that that will continue. We also, through the F40, are calling for significant change. The way the whole process is set up enables parents to particularly prescribe which schools they want their children to go to, more so than mainstream admissions processes. That is unhelpful in this space. So yes, it's likely to continue to rise. You will note from Claire's presentation that we have created resource-based type provisions over the last 18 months to try and ease some of this, but it is a particularly challenging place at this point. I would make the point that this local authority is experiencing the same challenges that are experienced nationally. For anybody that saw the leak from The Guardian last Friday, you will know that these similar trends were described, and including pressures on high needs deficit. From my memory and of that paper last Friday, the highest deficit was reported as Hampshire at 512 million. So, Chris, in answer to your question, yes, it is likely to continue.
Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. I'll come to Nikki Gilbert next, please.
Yeah, just a sort of a contextual explanation of what Liz has been saying already. There's a number of things. Obviously, it takes a while to build a new school, and you've got to demonstrate a need for a new school under the free school thing and when there's a free school bid. But the other thing is, as the head teacher of the school that has been identified in need of a rebuild or a refurb, the time frame, the joyous news of having been included on the DFE list for a rebuild was not joyous, because what it has led to is a delay of about 7 years in the potential rebuild of Westfield. So we would happily take more students. You know, the horrible phrase "unable to meet need" implies either that the staff here aren't competent of doing that, or that the pupil who is being consulted over is too much of a risk, neither of which is the case. But when you've got a school that has got capacity for 50, that's got 73, then you've got safeguarding concerns, and that's where we are. So whilst Westfield is on the list for a rebuild, and at some point in the future may be rebuilt, the current situation is that any pupil whose needs could be met if there were more classrooms, and I'm speaking for me, but I know Bars Court are the same. Black Marston recently had a rebuild, and they've got, you know, they're full, but they've got more spaces than others. The other thing is that the time frame. So when a child has an education, health and care plan, you know, schools, mainstream schools have waiting lists. You have the cutoff for school applications. You have first choice, second choice, third choice. When a child has an education, health and care plan, and that a school is consulted, you have 15 days to say yes or no. So once somebody sends a consult to one of the specialist provisions, we have to answer absolutely on the time frame that is current. And so the answer is always no, because the current situation is there are no spaces. We don't say, oh yes, I'll have you in September. We have to say yes or no right there and then. So that is why those students whose parents have been told that their mainstream setting can't meet need, and mainstream schools are saying they need a special school, there aren't any. So that's when young people whose needs could easily be met if there was capacity in the special schools in Herefordshire, they have to go to the independent schools who, you know, quality of education is not what it would be in one of the maintained schools in the majority of cases. Those schools traditionally were to meet the needs, the extreme needs of young people who cannot function in a class of 10 to 15. That's what those schools are good at doing. They have lots of outside space. They are expensive, but they're expensive because their class groups are even smaller than ours. Our class groups are almost now the same size as mainstream in some cases. But those independent schools now are having to accept, well, the local authority are having to consult with those schools who they would normally consult with over young people with far more extreme needs. But that's purely because we are full, and that is purely because the rebuild system doesn't work. So it kills me every time I have to say no. And I know my colleagues in Black Marston and Barscourt feel the same. But the reality is the finance is not going to get any better because we cost 10,000 plus top up. They cost about 120. So that is the reality. So just contextualizing, we are on a list. Yeah, we've tried and tried to get up higher on the list, but once we're on the DFE list, Herefordshire Council don't have to find the funds to build a new school because we're on the DFE list, and the DFE list have committed to doing that, but they haven't committed to doing that in the time frame that Herefordshire needs. I'm not talking about me. That is the logic behind it. So just illustrating Liz's point there, it's hugely frustrating for everyone.
Thank you, Nikki. I'll come to Paul Deneen, please.
First of all, to declare an interest, because trade unions were mentioned, I wasn't aware it was on the agenda, so I'm just making you aware, first of all. Secondly, to say huge thanks for the presentation. I thought it was excellent, and I think it just sets it all out. I think Nikki makes a very good point, and perhaps something we need to campaign on. If we're saying that money is tight, which... Sorry?
What time are they supposed to ring?
Sorry, I think Nikki's on the phone.
Oh, Nikki.
Nikki makes a very important point, really, which is that if we're trying to reduce costs or save money, and we're able to say if we increase the numbers in our special schools by getting a bigger build quicker, then over time we save a significant amount of money, which benefits the local our local situation. So it may be we need to sort of up that sort of commentary and involve our MPs in that to try and get the buildings much higher on the list so that the capacity can be increased, and then the reductions for the private providers are reduced significantly, because at the end of the day, I agree with Chris, you know, these costs are just, they go up and up and up, and the costs for placement within a special school in Herefordshire compared to the private school are, you know, ridiculously expensive. But I also just wanted to say the terrific work that is going on within the schools within Herefordshire, and also to pay tribute to the fact that the important thing is to help the young person at the earliest possible stage, and that's what's now happening, which wasn't happening before. So I just want to pay tribute to the fact that we seem to be all over this, and thanks to Liz and the team that the work that they're undertaking to try and get this right. And I think what we need to do is to see, you know, what best value we can get out of the money. And I think Nikki's comment earlier about, you know, if we can get more buildings and we can get people in on a much sort of, cheap is the wrong word really, but we get quality provision, then let's go for it and let's campaign for it, as well as campaigning for more funding anyway. Just some thoughts really.
Thank you, Paul. Liz, did you want to respond?
Thank you. Sorry to queue jump, Rachel. I was just going to respond if I could to some of those comments. Totally agree. On the surface, it looks, you know, absolutely agree. We need more special school places and investment in that part of our school estate. However, it is tricky. It is really, really tricky. We get a very small high needs capital grant for capital build in this space. and you'll be aware of recent projects where we have utilised that to add additional classrooms where we can. Herefordshire, in terms of our existing special school estate, quite difficult now to add on and add on. I think I hope Nikki would sort of agree with that in part as well. We've been doing that for a number of years, and we're fairly close to exhausting our options in that space. I spend an awful lot of my time galvanising and gaining political support in this space and presenting. I can't tell you how many presentations I've done this week to corporate leadership teams, to politicians, councillors, to explain in very simple terms the gap between the numbers of children that require special school education and the number of places we have. What I would say, in words of encouragement, is that message seems to have landed in a helpful way. However, we also know that local councils are pressed financially on a number of different agendas, and we know the impact of the high needs spend on local councils in March 2026. But I am going to keep hopeful. My teams have a number of business cases prepared and ready to go. And once again, we'll be asking for additional funding into this space along the lines, Paul, that you've talked about this morning. I'm sorry, I'm hogging the mic. Some representatives of Schools Forum and Early Years and Finance came along to the F40 conference earlier in the week. There is a national recognition that the SEND system is in crisis and is broken for many of the reasons we have discussed this morning. I am reliably informed by that campaign group, having listened to a number of political presentations on Tuesday, that Whitehall don't talk about potholes currently. They talk about SEND and what they're going to do about it. And I retain an optimism and a hopefulness that we can expect some movement in this space at some time soon. I'm assuming they're trying to beat March 2026 with their announcements. So I'm trying to keep some hope, but there is a national recognition that simply there is not enough investment into this space for the number of children that require the support and help.
Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Rachel.
Thank you. I just wondered if there were any indications about how these deficit budgets are going to be managed, because I appreciate that the need for option 2 within the SEN protection is to minimise the impact on that budget. But if our deficit is significantly less than others, is that the right thing to do? Because obviously that's going to impact on already stretched school budgets. So that's my question really. Has anyone got any indication of how those council budgets are going to be managed next year?
I can come in if that's helpful. I think what we want to make sure in our considerations next year with Budget Working Group around the SEN protection scheme is that it is targeted to where it is needed most. I am not under any instruction to slow spending whilst being very mindful of the impact of the deficit on the council potentially from March 2026. We are mindful of our statutory duties to ensure that children have a school place that meets their needs, and we're supporting our schools to do that. And we recognise we simply haven't got enough money to do it. So we will continue to spend, but I also think from a deficit management perspective, we need to absolutely ensure that the SEN protection scheme is reviewed and looked at so that it is well targeted to supporting schools with the inclusion agenda where necessary.
Thank you. Paul Jennings, as chair of the Budget Working Group, do you have any comments to make?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I mean, firstly, I echo the comments thanking Claire for her excellent presentations and for the clarity that she brings to the situation, which, you know, made the discussion at Budget Working Group relatively straightforward when it became clear that option one wasn't affordable. Our aim over the last few years really has been to do what's best for children and young people, and supporting that the SEN protection scheme is the only option as far as we're concerned. The concern, of course, is that for the following year, if we can't do that, the impact that could have on those young people and the schools that are working so hard to give them the support that they so desperately need to go on to be successful adults will be significant. And that was echoed quite strongly in the discussion that we had regarding this. As far as we were concerned, we share everybody's concerns about the funding situation and the increased demand. And I was at the meeting with Liz at the F40 on Tuesday, and there is hope. I think that we felt certainly that there is that national recognition, and that the wheels are in motion for something to be done about this situation nationally. As far as budget working group are concerned, we strongly supported option 2, which is what we have lent our support to, and would recommend that to Schools Forum this morning. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Paul. Are there any further comments this morning that anyone would like to make? Okay, thank you, everyone. I will now move to voting on the recommendations. Would the clerk please bring up the voting screen? Please cast your vote and press the submit button. If you can't see the screen or you're unable to vote, please raise your hand.
Thank you, Chair. 15 out of the 16 members have voted in support of those recommendations. That's approved.
Thank you. I now move to close the meeting. Thank you, everyone, for attending. I will call the meeting to a close. The next time we meet is Friday, the 11th of July.